What if the person you loved most in the world, the one you'd give up everything for, looked you in the eye and said you didn't exist to them? Not a sibling, not a friend, just a nobody who didn't belong in their shiny new life. Would you hold on, hoping they'd see you again? Or would you walk away, carrying the pieces of your broken heart? That's the question I've been wrestling with for a year, ever since my little brother, the kid I raised through fire and grief, stood on a stage at a glamorous gala and told a crowd of strangers I was just some worker who didn't matter. This story might shatter you, but it's also about finding light in the wreckage. So stay with me, because I need you to hear every word. My name's Ethan Carter, 41 years old, living in a small apartment above a hardware store in Bend, Oregon. I spend my days fixing what's broken: leaky pipes, dead alternators, tractors that groan like they're ready to quit. It's hard, honest work, the kind that leaves your hands rough, your clothes smelling of grease, and your body tired, but steady. When people ask about family, I give a half smile and say, just me and my tools, because the real answer's too heavy to share. My parents died when I was 18, and my younger brother, Caleb. He's a name I don't speak anymore, not because I don't care, but because a year ago, in front of a room full of wealthy strangers, he said I wasn't his brother. It was a crisp November evening in 2023, the kind where the air bites your skin and the sky feels heavy with secrets. I'd been called to a charity gala at a sleek hotel in downtown Portland, not as a guest, but to fix a glitch in the ballroom's sound system. The event was a big deal, a fundraiser for clean energy, with tickets costing more than I make in a month. $2,500 a seat, I overheard someone whisper. I showed up in my usual clothes, worn jeans faded at the knees, a flannel shirt with a frayed collar that I'd patched twice, and boots scuffed from years of hard use, the soles worn so thin I could feel every pebble. My toolbox rattled as I slipped through the service entrance, the faint sound of a violin quartet drifting through the walls, playing a melody that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I was backstage, kneeling beside a speaker, tracing a tangle of wires with a small flashlight clenched between my teeth. The air smelled of dust and metal, and my fingers were cold as I worked, trying to find the short that was causing static to crackle through the system. The event manager, a woman in a sharp black dress with her hair pulled into a tight bun, hurried over, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Ethan, can you check the spotlight rig? One of them's flickering and we can't have it mess up the keynote." Her voice was clipped, her eyes barely meeting mine, like I was just another piece of equipment to manage. I nodded, wiped my hands on my jeans, and grabbed my gear, a heavy canvas bag stuffed with tools I'd collected over the years. I climbed the narrow metal stairs to the lighting booth, a small platform overlooking the ballroom, my boots clanging softly with each step. It was a quick fix, loose wiring, nothing I hadn't seen 100 times before. But it gave me a clear view of the room below. The ballroom was like a dream I didn't belong in. Chandeliers sparkled like they were carved from light, casting a golden glow over tables draped in white linen, each one set with silverware that gleamed like it had never been touched. There were centerpieces on every table, tall glass vases filled with white orchids and fairy lights, their glow reflecting off the polished surfaces. Guests in tuxedos and gowns moved through the space, their laughter soft and polished, their hands holding flutes of champagne that caught the light and shimmered like liquid gold. A jazz quartet played in the corner, their notes weaving through the air like silk. Saxophone, piano, double bass, and drums, each musician in a crisp black suit, their music a backdrop to the hum of conversation. Waiters glided past with trays of hors d'oeuvres I'd never heard of, tiny pastries with names like foie gras tartlets and truffle-infused canapés, garnished with herbs that looked too perfect to eat, like they'd been plucked from a painting. I'm used to being invisible in places like this. People don't notice the guy with a screwdriver, the one who smells faintly of motor oil and sweat. And I've always been okay with that. I've spent my life fixing things in the background. Leaky faucets, broken heaters, engines that won't turn over, while others live in the spotlight. But then I heard a voice, smooth, confident, and so familiar, it stopped me cold. Our mission is to bring sustainable energy to every corner of this planet, to light up lives that have been left in the dark too long. My breath caught in my throat, sharp and sudden, like I'd been punched. I leaned over the railing, squinting through the crowd, my hands gripping the cold metal edge of the booth. And there he was, Caleb, my little brother, standing center stage, a microphone in his hand, a spotlight framing him like he was born for it. He looked like he'd stepped out of another world. His suit was tailored, dark and sharp, the kind that costs more than my truck. Charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, paired with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie the color of midnight. His hair was neatly combed, not a strand out of place, a far cry from the messy kid I used to tease about needing a haircut. His posture was easy but commanding, his shoulders back, his hands gesturing with a confidence I'd never seen in him before. Behind him, a massive screen cycled through images of wind turbines spinning against a golden sunset, solar panels gleaming under a clear blue sky, and smiling families in remote villages, their faces lit by the glow of a single bulb. His company's logo, Reed Renewables, glowed in bold blue letters at the bottom of each slide, a symbol of everything he'd built. My heart swelled, a mix of pride and ache that felt like it might crack my chest open. That was my brother, the kid I'd raised from 11 years old, now commanding a room of millionaires, people who could write checks with more zeros than I'd ever see in my life. I hadn't seen him in person in years, not since he'd moved to Seattle to build his empire, chasing a dream I'd always believed in, even when he doubted himself. I stayed in the shadows of the lighting booth, watching, thinking maybe I'd catch him afterward. Maybe we'd grab a coffee at some late-night diner and talk like we used to, before the distance between us grew too wide to cross. His speech was electric, the kind that makes you lean forward in your seat, hanging on every word. He spoke about a village in rural Africa, where his solar grids had brought light to a school for the first time, letting kids study past sunset, their laughter echoing through the night as they read their textbooks under a flickering bulb. He shared numbers that made the crowd murmur in approval. Carbon emissions cut by 15% in 3 years, a goal to power 1 million homes by 2030, partnerships with NGOs to bring clean water alongside clean energy. He told a story about a grandmother in Kenya who'd cried when she flipped a switch and light flooded her home for the first time, her hands trembling as she touched the bulb like it was a miracle. Caleb's voice was steady, his passion clear, but there was a polish to it now, a sharpness that came from years of boardrooms and investor pitches. The crowd hung on his every word, nodding, clapping at the right moments, their faces lit with admiration, some even wiping away tears. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, hands clapping like they wanted to give him everything: money, support, maybe even their dreams. Caleb stepped off the stage, shaking hands, flashing that boyish grin I remembered from our childhood, the one he'd give me when he'd figured out how to fix something on his own. I waited until the crowd around him thinned, then made my way down the stairs, my boots loud against the marble floor, each step echoing in my ears. I felt out of place, like a smudge on a polished mirror, my reflection in the glass walls, showing a man who didn't belong. Too rough, too worn, too small for this glittering world. But I didn't care. This was Caleb, my brother. "Caleb," I called, my voice rough from the cold and the dust, cracking a little as I tried to keep it steady. "Didn't expect to see you here. You were incredible up there." He turned, and for a split second, I thought I saw warmth in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even joy, the kind we used to share over a shared pizza or a late-night project. But then his face tightened, like a door slamming shut, his jaw clenching as his eyes flicked over me. My flannel shirt, my toolbox, my hands stained with years of grease and grime, the kind of dirt that never really washes out. Something in him shifted, a shadow crossing his features, and I felt the air between us grow heavy, like a storm rolling in. Before he could speak, a man in a velvet blazer, probably a donor with a watch that cost more than my rent, clapped Caleb's shoulder and said, "Brilliant speech, Caleb. Is this a friend of yours?" He glanced at me, his smile polite but curious, taking in my rough edges, his eyes lingering on the toolbox in my hand, like it was a foreign object in this pristine space. Caleb hesitated, just long enough for my heart to sink, a cold weight settling in my chest. Then he chuckled, a sound that didn't reach his eyes, a hollow, practiced laugh that I'd never heard from him before, and said, "No, he's just some worker here. Fixing the lights, right?" The words landed like a hammer, heavy and unyielding, each one a blow I hadn't braced for. I stood there, my smile frozen on my face, my toolbox suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hand. The man nodded, chuckling like it was nothing, a light-hearted dismissal, and moved on to another guest, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he walked away. Caleb didn't look at me. He turned back to the crowd, his voice smooth as he answered a question about energy grids, his tone as polished as ever, like I'd never been there at all. I was nothing, not his brother, not the guy who'd given up everything for him, not even a memory worth acknowledging. Just some worker, a ghost to be brushed aside in his perfect, glittering world. I don't remember walking out. My feet moved on their own, carrying me through the service entrance, past the violin quartet still playing their haunting melody, past the waiters with their trays of untouched canapes. The next thing I knew, I was in my truck, the city lights blurring through the rain on my windshield, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles burned, the skin stretched white over bone. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. But something inside me shattered, something I'd been holding together since I was 18, a fragile thread that had kept me going through every late night, every skipped meal, every dream I'd buried for him. I drove the long road back to Bend, the highway stretching dark and empty, Caleb's words echoing louder than the rain, louder than the hum of my engine, louder than the ache in my chest. To understand why those words cut so deep, you need to know where we started. I was 18 when our parents died in a fire. It was a quiet Sunday in Eugene, Oregon, in the fall of 2001, the kind of day you don't think twice about. We were at the dinner table, Mom stirring a pot of chili on the stove, the kitchen warm with the smell of cumin and tomatoes, the steam fogging up the window above the sink. Dad was telling a story about his old army buddy, a guy named Tommy, who'd once driven a Jeep straight through a mud pit on a dare, his laughter filling the room as he gestured with his fork. Caleb, 11 years old, was sketching a spaceship with colored pencils, his tongue poking out in concentration, the paper covered in wild lines of red and blue. I was halfway through a bite of cornbread, the kind Mom made with a little honey in the batter, when we heard a faint crackle from upstairs. Then, a spark in the attic, faulty wiring, the fire chief later said, turned our world to ash. The smoke alarm screamed, a piercing wail that cut through the air, and I can still hear it in my nightmares, sharp and relentless. I grabbed Caleb's hand, his small fingers trembling in mine, and we ran, stumbling over the threshold as Mom shouted for us to get out. I looked back just once, seeing the flames licking down the staircase, the heat so fierce it felt like my skin was melting, and I knew they weren't coming with us. We made it to the street, barefoot, the pavement cold under our feet, and watched as the flames swallowed our home, orange and red against the darkening sky, the roar of the fire drowning out our screams. Caleb's face was pale and small, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaking down his cheeks as he clutched my arm, his voice a broken whisper. "Where's Mom? Where's Dad?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, under a neighbor's porch light, the air thick with the smell of smoke, I held his hand and promised we'd be okay. Even though I had no idea how, even though my own heart was breaking into pieces too small to ever fit back together. After the funeral, there was nothing left. No insurance, no savings, just a duffel bag of clothes and a few scorched photos I'd pulled from the rubble, their edges curled and blackened, but the faces still visible. Mom laughing at a picnic, Dad with his arm around me at a baseball game. We moved into a basement apartment in a rough part of town, paid for with what I earned washing dishes at a diner called Rosie's, a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl seats, and a neon sign that buzzed every time it flickered on. The apartment was cold, the walls stained with damp, the air always heavy with the smell of mildew and cigarette smoke from the tenants upstairs. The single window was half blocked by a rusted fire escape, letting in just enough light to remind us of what we'd lost. But it was a roof, and that's what mattered. I was set to start college that fall. Oregon State had given me a full ride for mechanical engineering, a dream I'd had since I was a kid, taking apart radios and old clocks to see how they worked, my fingers always itching to build something new. Friends, teachers, even the pastor at our church told me not to give it up. "You're too smart to throw this away, Ethan," my high school counselor had said, her voice heavy with concern as she handed me a brochure for the engineering program, the pages glossy with promise. But I looked at Caleb, curled up on a thrift store mattress in the corner of our new place, clutching a stuffed dinosaur he'd saved from the fire, its green felt singed at the edges, and I knew I couldn't leave him. He was my brother. He was my world. I called the university the next morning, my voice steady even as my hands shook, and declined the scholarship. "I'm sorry," the admissions officer said, her tone soft with pity. "If you change your mind, let us know." I hung up, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, and by noon, I was at a construction site, signing on as a laborer, hauling lumber until my shoulders screamed, the splinters digging into my palms like tiny knives. At night, I worked the grill at Rosie's, flipping burgers while the jukebox played old country tunes, Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, songs that reminded me of Dad, his voice humming along as we'd worked on projects in the garage. The diner was always busy, the air thick with the smell of frying onions and burnt coffee, the waitresses shouting orders over the clatter of plates. I'd stand at the grill, sweat dripping down my back, my hands moving on autopilot as I cooked, my mind replaying Dad's stories, Mom's laugh, the way Caleb used to smile before the fire took it all. Every dollar I made went to rent, groceries, and Caleb's needs. Notebooks for school, pencils with erasers that didn't smudge, a pair of sneakers when his old ones split at the toes, the soles flapping as he walked. I didn't mind the exhaustion. Not really. As long as Caleb had a warm bed and a chance to dream, I felt like I was keeping a promise. Not just to him, but to Dad, to the family we'd been before the flames. Dad's last words to me were 3 weeks before the fire. We'd been in the garage, sanding down an old cedar chest he was restoring for Mom, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked me square in the eye, and said, "Ethan, you're the big brother. If anything ever happens to me and your mom, you've got to take care of Caleb. He's got big dreams, but he'll need you to get there." I nodded, thinking it was just one of those things parents say, the kind of advice you tuck away and forget. But those words became my anchor, My reason to keep going when the days felt too heavy to carry, when the weight of being 18 and suddenly a parent to an 11-year-old felt like it might crush me. Caleb was a dreamer from the start, even in the aftermath of the fire, even when the world seemed determined to break him. At 12, he'd spend hours in our tiny apartment, building circuits from scavenged electronics, old clocks I'd found in the diner's dumpster, a broken Walkman a neighbor had thrown out, a flashlight he'd taken apart just to see how it ticked, its pieces scattered across our wobbly kitchen table. "I'm gonna invent something huge, Ethan," he'd say, his hands smudged with solder, his eyes bright with possibility, a spark the fire couldn't touch. Maybe a robot that cleans the ocean, or a car that runs on sunlight. I loved that spark in him, that hunger to be more than our circumstances, to reach for something bigger than the damp walls and the flickering fluorescent light of our basement. I made sure he had what he needed, a library card to check out science books, their pages worn and dog-eared from his constant reading. A cheap soldering kit I found at a pawn shop for $15, its plastic case cracked but functional. Entry fees for local robotics competitions, where he'd show up with his homemade gadgets, his head held high even when the other kids had fancy kits their parents had bought. When he was 14, his middle school teacher called me in for a meeting. I showed up straight from the construction site, my boots still dusted with sawdust, my hands smelling of grease. "Caleb's special," she said, pushing up her glasses, her desk cluttered with papers, and a coffee mug that said, "Best teacher ever." He could go to MIT, Stanford, you name it, if he gets the right support. He's got a mind for engineering, but he needs stability, someone to keep him on track. I shook her hand, my palms rough from work, and promised I'd give him that support, no matter what it cost, even as I felt the weight of her words settle on my shoulders like a physical thing. By the time Caleb hit high school, I was working 3 jobs, construction during the day, where I'd haul concrete blocks under the Oregon sun until my back ached, Rosie's at night, where I'd work the grill until 1 a.m., the heat from the stove making my shirt stick to my skin, and weekends at a salvage yard, sorting scrap metal until my hands bled, the cuts stinging as I washed them in the cracked sink of our apartment. I'd come home at 2 a.m., my boots caked with mud, my body screaming for rest, and find Caleb asleep at our wobbly kitchen table, a physics textbook open in front of him, a half-finished circuit board next to him, its wires tangled like a spiderweb. I'd smile, drape a blanket over his shoulders, and feel a quiet pride that kept me going, a warmth that cut through the exhaustion. One night, I caught him watching me as I unlaced my boots, his eyes full of guilt, the dim light casting shadows on his young face. "You don't have to work so much, Ethan," he said, his voice small, barely above a whisper. I ruffled his hair, my fingers catching in the tangles, and said, "I'm fine, kid. You just keep building those gadgets." He nodded, but I saw the weight in his eyes, like he knew what I was giving up, even if he didn't say it, even if he couldn't fully understand the cost. When Caleb was 15, I took him to his first science expo in Portland, a 4-hour drive each way in my beat-up truck, the engine rattling like it might give out any second. He'd spent weeks preparing, staying up late to build a small wind turbine from scrap aluminum and a broken bike wheel, testing it in the alley behind our building with a hairdryer I'd borrowed from a neighbor. We packed it into the truck, the blades wrapped in an old blanket so they wouldn't bend, and drove through the early morning mist, the cascades rising like shadows on the horizon. At the expo, Caleb set up his booth between kids with sleek, store-bought models, their parents hovering with proud smiles and expensive cameras. He didn't care. He explained his project to the judges with a confidence I hadn't seen before, his hands gesturing wildly as he talked about renewable energy, his voice steady even when one of the blades wobbled during the demo. He didn't win, but a judge, an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, pulled me aside after. "Your brother's got something special," he said, clapping my shoulder. "Keep supporting him. He's going places." I nodded, my throat tight, and we drove home that night with Caleb clutching a participation certificate, his smile brighter than any trophy. We stopped at a diner on the way back, splitting a plate of fries and a milkshake, the neon sign outside buzzing as we laughed about the judge who'd sneezed during Caleb's presentation. It was one of those nights I'd hold on to, a memory that felt like a lifeline in the years to come. When Caleb was 16, he entered a regional science fair with a solar-powered water purifier he'd built from scrap. He spent weeks on it, staying up late, testing it with dirty water from the creek behind our building, his hands stained with rust and algae as he adjusted the filters. I helped him carry it to the fair, a clunky thing made of plastic bottles, copper wire, and a small solar panel he'd scavenged from a broken garden light, the whole contraption held together with duct tape and hope. I watched him present to the judges, his voice steady, his hands waving with excitement as he explained how it could bring clean water to remote areas, his eyes lighting up when he talked about the chemistry of filtration. He took third place, not first, but he was glowing, clutching his ribbon like it was a medal, a cheap piece of satin that meant the world to him. We celebrated with milkshakes at Rosie's, sitting in a booth by the window, the neon sign buzzing above us, casting a pink glow over his proud face. "You're the best, Ethan," he said, his mouth full of chocolate, his smile so wide I could see the gap where he'd lost a tooth years ago. "I'm gonna make us proud." I believed him. I always did. At 17, Caleb got accepted to MIT's engineering program, partial scholarship, but the rest was a mountain of costs: tuition, housing, books, travel. It added up to more than I'd see in a decade, numbers that made my head spin when I saw the financial aid packet: $60,000 a year, even with the scholarship covering half. He showed me the acceptance letter one evening, sitting at our kitchen counter, his hands trembling as he held the paper, his voice a mix of joy and doubt. "Ethan, can we do this?" he asked, looking up at me like I had all the answers, his eyes searching mine for certainty. I pulled him into a hug, my throat tight, my shirt still damp with sweat from a long day at the salvage yard, and said, "You're going, kid. I'll figure it out." Figuring it out meant selling the only thing I had left of Dad, a 1967 Ford Mustang, cherry red, the car we'd spent weekends polishing together in the driveway, the radio tuned to classic rock as we worked. I could still feel his hand on my shoulder, hear his voice saying, "This baby's gonna outlive us both," his grin wide as we'd take it for a spin down the back roads, the engine roaring as the wind whipped through the open windows. It was more than a car. It was Saturday mornings, with the smell of wax and oil, the sound of Springsteen on the radio, the way Dad would laugh when I'd rev the engine too hard, his hand ruffling my hair as he said, "Easy, kid." Selling it felt like losing him all over again, a second funeral I hadn't prepared for. I took it for one last drive, the engine rumbling under my hands, the road blurring as I fought tears, the memories flooding back. Dad teaching me to drive in an empty parking lot, the two of us washing it in the summer sun, the way he'd looked at me with pride when I'd fixed the carburetor on my own. I parked at the buyer's lot, a guy in a polo shirt waiting with a check, his eyes lighting up as he ran his hand over the hood. "She's a beauty," he said, his voice full of admiration. I nodded, signed the papers with a shaking hand, and walked away, the money heavy in my pocket, $12,000 that felt like a betrayal. It covered Caleb's first year, pronunciation, dorm, flights to Boston, a used laptop for his coding classes, its keys sticky but functional. For the rest, I took out a loan against my wages, promising the auto shop owner I'd pay it back over time, $20,000 at 8% interest, the payments eating into my grocery budget until I was living on ramen and coffee. I'd skip meals to make the payments, telling myself it was temporary, that Caleb's future was worth it. I didn't tell Caleb about the Mustang. I said the money was from extra shifts because I didn't want him to feel the weight of it, didn't want him to know what I'd given up. I wanted him to run toward his future, not look back at what it cost me, not carry the guilt I saw in his eyes whenever he noticed how tired I was. The day I drove him to the airport, the Oregon sky was gray, the air heavy with autumn's chill, the leaves a dull brown as they fell from the trees. Caleb stood at the security gate, his backpack stuffed with clothes and books, his boarding pass creased from nervous fingers, his MIT hoodie already a little faded from the wash. He turned to me, his eyes shining with tears he tried to blink away, and hugged me so tight I could feel his heartbeat, his arms trembling as he held on. "I'm gonna make you proud, Ethan," he said, his voice cracking, the words muffled against my shoulder. "I owe you everything." I ruffled his hair, same as always, my fingers catching in the tangles, and said, "Just do your thing, kid. That's all I need." I watched him disappear through security, his backpack bouncing as he walked, and I stood there until he was out of sight. The airport buzzing around me, announcements over the intercom, families hugging, the smell of burnt coffee from a nearby kiosk. I drove home alone, the silence in the truck louder than any song, the empty passenger seat a reminder of how much had changed. A week later, he texted me a photo. Him outside an MIT lecture hall, grinning in his hoodie, the Boston skyline behind him, all glass and steel against a crisp fall sky. "Day one, bro. Thanks for making this real," the caption read, followed by a string of smiley faces. I saved that picture, kept it on my phone through the years, pulling it up when the nights got too quiet, when the apartment felt more like a shell than a home, the loneliness creeping in like a cold draft. Every few weeks he'd send updates. "Built a solar panel prototype today," or "Got an A in thermodynamics." I'd reply, "Knew you had it in you," and mean every word, my chest swelling with pride even as the distance between us grew. I sent money when I could, $300 for textbooks when he couldn't afford the latest edition, $800 for rent when his part-time job at a campus cafe fell through, the manager cutting his hours without warning. Caleb didn't ask often, but I knew MIT wasn't cheap, and I wanted him to focus on his studies, not stress about bills, not feel the weight I carried every day. But over time, the messages thinned, like a river drying up in the heat of summer. A call every month became a text every few months, each one shorter, more distant, the words clipped and hurried. "Swamped with projects," he'd say, or "I'll call soon," a promise he rarely kept. The calls stopped coming altogether after his second year, replaced by silence that felt heavier than any words. After graduation, Caleb stayed in Boston, working at a tech startup for a year, then moved to Seattle for a job at a clean energy company, climbing the ranks faster than I could keep track of. I'd hear about him through stray comments, a customer at the hardware store mentioning a young hotshot named Reed in a tech article, or a friend forwarding a LinkedIn post about his latest venture, a clean energy startup called Reed Renewables that had just raised $10 million in funding. I was proud, but it hurt to learn about his life from strangers, to piece together his successes from fragments instead of hearing them from him. He'd call once a year, maybe, always rushed, like he was ticking off a chore on a list. "You good, Ethan?" he'd ask, his voice distant, the background noise of a busy office or a crowded restaurant drowning out any warmth. "Yeah, fine," I'd say, even when the loan payments ate half my paycheck, even when I hadn't slept a full night in weeks, even when I felt like I was disappearing. 5 years ago, in 2018, I moved to Bend, renting the apartment above Pete's hardware store, a small shop on the edge of town with a faded sign and a bell that jingled every time the door opened. Pete's an old-timer, gruff but kind, with a white beard and a limp from an old logging accident, who let me fix things around the shop. Shelves that wobbled, plumbing that leaked, the ancient furnace that groaned like it was on its last legs, for a break on rent, knocking $200 off the $600 monthly cost. It's not fancy, just a one-bedroom with a sagging couch I found at a thrift store, a workbench where I tinker with broken clocks and radios, their gears and springs a puzzle that keeps my hands busy, and a coffee pot that takes 5 minutes to sputter to life. The brew always a little burnt, but good enough. The walls are thin, the paint peeling in spots, and the floor creaks with every step. But it's mine, a space I've carved out in a world that feels too big sometimes. At night, I'll sit on the fire escape, a beer in hand, watching the stars over the Deschutes River, their light reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds, trying not to wonder where Caleb's gone, trying not to feel the ache of his absence. 3 years back, in 2020, I reached out to him, a flicker of hope driving me to try one more time. My repair jobs were steady, small gigs that kept the lights on, fixing a farmer's tractor, rewiring a neighbor's porch light, patching a leaky pipe for the diner down the street. But I had a dream, a real shop of my own, with a sign out front that said, "Carter's Fixes," a bay for cars, and maybe a corner where I could teach kids to fix things, pass on what I'd learned over the years, give them the kind of guidance I'd wished for at their age. I thought Caleb, with his startup money and investor friends, might want in. Not charity, just a partnership, a way to build something together like we used to dream about as kids. I wrote him a long email laying out my plan. The lot I'd found on the outskirts of Bend, a half-acre of flat land for $50,000. The costs for a small building, tools and permits, about $80,000 more. Even a name, Carter's Fixes, a nod to our shared past. "Could we talk?" I asked at the end, my fingers hesitating over the keys. "Maybe build something together," he replied a week later, his response short and cold, like a business memo. "Sounds nice, but I'm all in on my projects. Capital's tied up in growth markets. Let's catch up soon." No warmth, no questions about me, no hint of the brother I'd known. Just a door closed politely but firmly, the kind of rejection that stings more than an outright no. I didn't write back. I told myself he was busy, that he'd come around, that success had a way of pulling people away for a while. But deep down, I knew he was slipping away, the gap between us widening with every unanswered text, every unreturned call. Then came that night at the gala, when Caleb's words, "some worker," tore through me like shrapnel, each syllable a jagged edge that cut deeper than I thought possible. I drove home in silence, the road stretching dark and empty ahead of me, the rain a steady drum against the roof of my truck. My apartment felt like a cage, the walls too close, the air too still, the silence louder than any noise. I lay on the couch, staring at a crack in the ceiling that I'd been meaning to patch for months, and let the memories flood in, each one a weight I couldn't shake, a reminder of everything I'd given and everything I'd lost. I thought about the fire, how it hadn't just taken Mom and Dad, but my future too. I'd chosen Caleb over college, over dreams of designing bridges or building machines that could change the world, dreams I'd scribbled in notebooks as a kid, pages filled with sketches of gears and circuits. I didn't regret it, not exactly, but I couldn't help wondering, what would my life be if I'd said yes to that scholarship? Would I be the one in the suit, shaking hands with donors, my name on a company logo? Or would I still be me, just enough for him to see me, to claim me as his brother? I remembered our first Christmas without them, December 2001, just a few months after the fire. Caleb was 12, and I'd scraped together $30 to buy him a model rocket kit from a pawn shop. Its box dented, but the pieces all there. I'd wrapped it in newspaper, the only thing I had, and placed it under a tiny tree I'd cut from the edge of a vacant lot, decorating it with string and a few foil stars Caleb had made at school. His eyes lit up when he tore open the wrapping, his smile brighter than any Christmas lights, and we spent all night gluing fins and painting it red, laughing until we forgot how empty the apartment felt, the cold seeping through the walls. "We're gonna launch it, right?" he'd asked, his voice full of hope. "Soon as the snow melts," I'd promised, and we did, a few months later, watching it soar into the sky on a clear spring day, a small victory in a world that felt too heavy. I remembered his first science fair, how he'd won 3rd place with a solar-powered fan he'd built from scrap, a contraption of wire and plastic that looked like it might fall apart, but worked perfectly, spinning under the judge's flashlight. He'd hugged me so tight I could feel his heartbeat, whispering, "You're the best, Ethan. I'm gonna make us proud," his voice muffled against my jacket, his ribbon clutched in his small hand. I'd smiled, ruffling his hair, and said, "You already do, kid," meaning every word, the pride in my chest a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I remembered the first time we went camping after the fire, just the two of us, trying to find something normal again, something that felt like the life we'd had. We drove out to the Cascades in the summer of 2002, set up a tent by a lake, the water so clear you could see the pebbles at the bottom, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. I built a fire with shaky hands, the flames making me flinch every time they crackled. But I did it for Caleb, for the smile on his face as he roasted marshmallows, the golden crust dripping onto his fingers. He pointed out constellations, Orion, Ursa Major, his finger tracing the shapes in the sky, his voice full of wonder, like the stars were a promise of something better, a future we could still have. We fell asleep to the sound of crickets, the fire dying down to embers, and for a moment, I felt like I could hold the world together for him, like I could be enough. I remembered the day he left for MIT, August 2008, how I'd stood at the airport, watching him disappear through security, his backpack bouncing as he walked, his head turning back one last time to wave, his smile nervous but excited. I'd driven home alone, the silence in the truck louder than any song, the empty seat beside me a reminder of how much I'd given, how much I'd lost. I spent the night on the fire escape, staring at the sky, hoping I'd done enough, hoping he'd find everything I'd dreamed for him. And I remembered selling Dad's Mustang, the memory so vivid it felt like it happened yesterday. I'd driven it one last time, the engine rumbling under my hands, the radio playing Springsteen, Thunder Road, Dad's favorite, the road blurring as I fought tears, the memories of him so close I could almost hear his laugh. Letting it go felt like burying him all over again, the ache in my chest a physical thing. But I did it for Caleb, because I believed in him, because I loved him, because I'd promised Dad I'd take care of him, no matter what. The weeks after the gala were a fog, each day blending into the next, a gray haze I couldn't shake. I worked, fixed pipes that leaked, rewired outlets that sparked, changed oil in cars that had seen better days. But it was like moving underwater, every motion slow and heavy, my mind stuck on that night, on Caleb's words, on the way he'd looked right through me. I'd catch myself staring at my phone, waiting for a text that never came, the screen blank except for the occasional spam email or a reminder to pay a bill. One night, I pulled out an old shoebox from under my bed, the cardboard soft and worn, filled with things I'd kept from our past. A photo of us at the lake, Caleb's grin wide as he held a fish he'd caught, his science fair ribbon, the satin faded but still blue. A postcard he'd sent from Boston his freshman year, the skyline on the front, his messy scrawl on the back. "Miss you, bro." I traced the words with my finger, wondering when I'd stopped being someone he missed, when I'd become someone he could erase. 2 months later, in January 2024, I was at the hardware store, restocking Pete's shelves with screws and nails, the air smelling of sawdust and metal, when Maria, a friend who ran the local food bank, came by. She's a small woman with graying hair and a laugh that fills a room, always wearing bright scarves that clash with her practical jeans. "Ethan, you hear about your brother?" she said, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine. "His company's in trouble. Big investor pulled out. It's all over the news." I shrugged, said I hadn't heard, my voice flat as I stacked a box of bolts. But that night, I looked it up on my ancient laptop, the screen flickering as I typed. The headline was blunt: "Reed Renewables loses major funding, future uncertain." The article detailing how a $15 million investment had fallen through, leaving Caleb's company on shaky ground, its stock plummeting 30% in a day. No mention of Caleb by name, but I knew it was his dream crumbling, the empire he'd built starting to crack. I didn't feel satisfied or angry, not the way I thought I might. I just felt hollow, like a part of me was breaking all over again, not for me, but for him, for the kid who'd dreamed of changing the world, who'd promised to make us proud. I wanted to reach out, to tell him I was still here, but the memory of the gala stopped me, the sting of his words a barrier I couldn't cross. Then, one rainy afternoon in February 2024, I was under a sink at a client's house, wrestling with a stubborn pipe, my hand slick with water, my knees aching against the cold tile floor, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first, focusing on the wrench in my hand, but it buzzed again, insistent. I wiped my hands on a rag, pulled it out, and saw Caleb's name flashing on the screen, a name I hadn't seen in months. My heart pounded, a mix of hope and dread, and I let it ring, watching the screen until it went to voicemail, the notification blinking like a warning. I finished the job, packed up my tools, and sat in my truck, the rain hammering the roof, the sound a steady drum that matched the beat of my pulse. I played the message, my finger hesitating over the button. "Ethan," his voice said, low and unsteady, a tone I hadn't heard from him in years, raw and broken. I screwed up, not just with work, but with you. What I said at the gala. I didn't mean it. I've been sick over it ever since. Can we talk? Please? His voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear the hum of traffic in the background, like he was calling from a street corner, the rain on his end, matching the storm outside my truck. I listened to it 3 times, each word sinking deeper, stirring up a mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. Hurt, love, anger, hope, all knotted together in my chest. I didn't call back right away. I needed time to sort through the mess in my head, to figure out what I felt, what I wanted. A week later, I texted him, my fingers slow on the keys. Diner on Main, Saturday, 1 p.m. No promises, just a chance, a small step toward something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The diner was a time capsule, a relic from another era. Checkered floor, vinyl booths with cracks in the seats, a jukebox in the corner that played Elvis on loop, hound dog echoing softly as I walked in. The air smelled of coffee and bacon, the kind of comfort that felt like a warm blanket on a cold day. I got there early, ordered a black coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and sat by the window, watching rain pool on the sidewalk, the drops racing down the glass like tears. When Caleb walked in, he looked different. No suit, just a sweater and jeans. His shoulders slumped like he was carrying the world, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He slid into the booth across from me, his hands fidgeting with a napkin, tearing it into small pieces as he sat. "Thanks for coming," he said, barely meeting my eyes, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." I nodded, sipping my coffee, the bitterness sharp on my tongue, waiting. I wasn't going to fill the silence for him, wasn't going to make this easy. He'd hurt me, and I needed to hear what he had to say, needed to know if he meant it. He took a shaky breath, his hand stilling for a moment. "That night at the gala," I choked. "Those people, they're sharks. They size you up, your suit, your job, your story. I thought if I said you were my brother, they'd see me as less, like I didn't belong, like I was still the kid from the basement apartment who didn't have a dime to his name. It was a split-second choice, and it was the wrong one. I've been sick over it ever since." I stayed quiet, letting his words hang in the air, heavy between us. I wanted to believe him, but the memory of that night was still raw, like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing, the pain flaring with every touch. "I didn't mean it," he said, his voice cracking, his eyes finally meeting mine, wet with unshed tears. "You're my brother, Ethan. You're why I'm here. MIT, the company, all of it. I got lost in this world I thought I needed, where everything's about status and deals, where you have to be someone else to fit in. I pushed you away because you remind me of home, of who I really am, and I was scared to face that, scared to admit how much I've changed." I set my cup down, the clink loud in the quiet booth, my voice low but firm, each word deliberate. "You didn't just push me away, Caleb. You erased me. I gave up everything. College, Dad's car, any chance at a life of my own so you could have yours. I worked until my hands bled to keep you fed, to keep you dreaming, to make sure you had a shot at the life you wanted. And you stood there, in front of people who don't know you, who don't know us, and said I was nobody. Do you know what that did to me?" His face fell, tears welling in his eyes, spilling over as he blinked. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I saw it, even when you hid it. The late nights, the way you'd skip meals so I could eat, the smile you'd fake when I told you about school, acting like everything was fine. I told myself I'd make it right, that I'd build something big enough to pull you out of that life, to give you back everything you gave me. But I got caught up, and I lost sight of what mattered. I'm so sorry, Ethan." I leaned back, my chest tight, the ache in my throat making it hard to speak. "Sorry doesn't fix it," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I don't need your money or your pity. I needed my brother, the one who used to call me from Boston, who promised we'd always have each other, who'd laugh with me over a stupid model rocket." "Where'd he go?" He looked down, his hands trembling, the napkin now a pile of shredded pieces. "He's still here," he said, his voice soft but firm, a flicker of the old Caleb in his tone. "I messed up, but I want to make it right. Not with words, but with time, if you'll give me a chance." We sat there, the diner's hum filling the space, waitresses calling orders, the sizzle of fries on the grill, the jukebox switching to jailhouse rock, the notes a faint backdrop to our silence. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let the hurt win, to protect myself from more pain. But another part, the part that still saw Caleb as the kid with the rocket kit, the kid I'd raised, the kid I'd loved through every hardship, wanted to believe he meant it, wanted to believe we could find our way back. "I don't know what happens next," I said, finally, my voice quieter now, the edge gone. "But I'm not shutting you out. You want a chance? Show up, be here, not as some big-shot CEO, but as my brother." He nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes, a small smile breaking through the tears. "I will," he said. "I promise." We didn't hug or make grand gestures. I paid for my coffee. He left a tip, a crumpled $5 bill on the table, and we walked out into the rain, side by side but still a little apart. The space between us smaller, but still there. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start, a fragile bridge we could maybe cross together. The months after were slow, tentative, like learning to walk again after a long fall. Caleb texted more, not essays, but small things. A photo of a wind farm he'd visited in eastern Washington, the turbines spinning against a gray sky, a dumb meme about mechanics, a cartoon wrench with a goofy grin, a quick "you free this weekend" that made my heart lift, even if just a little. I didn't always reply right away, the hurt still lingering, but I kept the messages, let them pile up like stones, marking a path back to something we'd lost, a connection we were trying to rebuild. One Saturday in April 2024, he drove down from Seattle, showed up at my door with a pizza and a deck of cards we used to play with as kids, the edges worn from years of use. We sat at my workbench, the pizza box open between us, eating pepperoni slices that were still warm, laughing over old rules we'd made up. Aces wild, jokers worth 10 points, a game we'd invented one rainy afternoon when the power went out. For a few hours, it was just us. No ballrooms or broken promises, just two brothers finding their way. The laughter a balm to wounds that still ached. I didn't tell him about the land, not yet. 2 years before the gala, in 2021, I'd done something nobody knew, a quiet act of defiance against everything we'd lost. I'd saved every spare dime, taken extra jobs, late-night shifts at a warehouse, odd jobs fixing fences and decks for neighbors, and bought back the lot where our house had stood before the fire. It was just dirt now, a flat patch of earth in Eugene with no trace of our old life, the grass long gone, the foundation bulldozed years ago. But I'd signed the papers quietly, paid $35,000 in cash, every penny I had, and kept the deed in a locked drawer, a small metal box under my workbench. I didn't buy it to live there, didn't plan to build on it. I bought it to hold on to something, maybe for us, maybe just for me, a piece of our past I couldn't let go of. I'd mentioned it to Caleb once, in that email about the shop, but he'd called it a nice thought, but not practical, his words a dismissal that stung more than I'd let on. I didn't bring it up again. Not then, not when the wound was still fresh. But now, with things shifting, with Caleb showing up with pizza and cards, I wondered if he'd want to see it one day, to stand where we'd started and remember the life we'd had before everything changed. The land wasn't just a piece of dirt to me. It was a tether, a connection to the family we'd been, to the moments that had shaped us. I remembered the summer of 1999, when I was 15, and Caleb was 8, and we'd spent a whole afternoon in the backyard of that house, trying to build a treehouse in the old oak that stood at the edge of the property. Dad had helped us, his hands steady as he hammered nails into the wood, his laughter loud when Caleb accidentally dropped a plank on his own foot, hopping around on one leg while we all doubled over. Mom had brought out lemonade, the ice clinking in the glasses, her sundress fluttering in the breeze as she called us down for a break, her voice warm with love. We'd sat under that tree, the four of us, sipping lemonade and talking about nothing and everything. School, Dad's latest project at work, Caleb's obsession with astronauts. The treehouse never got finished. School started, and life got in the way. But that day stayed with me, a snapshot of happiness I could still feel, even after the fire took it all away. Standing on that lot now, I could almost hear their voices, almost see the ghost of that oak tree, its branches stretching toward a sky that had once felt endless. I started visiting the lot more often after the gala, driving out on weekends with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair I kept in the back of my truck. I'd sit there for hours, the deed in my pocket, watching the sun move across the sky, the shadows shifting over the empty earth. Sometimes I'd bring a sketch pad, drawing plans for the shop I still dreamed of. Nothing fancy, just a small garage with a workbench, a lift for cars, and a sign out front that said, "Carter's Fixes," in bold, simple letters. Other times, I'd just sit and think, letting the memories wash over me like a tide, each one a wave that brought both pain and comfort. I thought about the time Caleb had fallen off his bike in the driveway, his knee scraped and bloody, and how I'd carried him inside, Mom cleaning the wound, while Dad told him stories about brave explorers to keep him from crying. I thought about the Christmas mornings we'd spent in that house, the living room filled with the smell of pine and cinnamon, Caleb tearing into his presents with a grin that lit up the room, Mom and Dad watching us with quiet pride. I thought about the fire, too. Not just the night it happened, but the days after. The way the air had smelled of ash for weeks. The way Caleb had clung to me in his sleep, his small body trembling with nightmares I couldn't chase away. One evening, as I sat on the lot, the sky turning a deep indigo, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos. Not the ones from the shoebox, but the ones I'd saved over the years. Snapshots of Caleb's journey. There was the picture he'd sent from MIT, his grin wide against the Boston skyline. The one I'd looked at so many times the screen had smudges over his face. There was a blurry shot from his high school graduation in 2007, him in a cap and gown, holding up his diploma with a smile that made my chest ache, me standing off to the side, clapping until my hands hurt. There was a photo I'd taken at Rosie's after his science fair win, Caleb holding his ribbon, a milkshake in front of him, his eyes bright with triumph. I lingered on each one, tracing the arc of his life, the dreams I'd helped him chase, the dreams I'd let go of to get him there. I didn't feel bitter. Not anymore. Just a quiet ache, a longing for the connection we'd lost, and a flicker of hope that maybe we could find it again. In May 2024, a few weeks after our pizza night, Caleb called me. Not a text, but an actual call, his name lighting up my phone as I was fixing a lawnmower in Pete's shop, my hands black with grease. I wiped them on a rag, my heart thudding, and answered. "Hey, Ethan," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years, a warmth in it I hadn't heard since he was a kid. "I was wondering, you free this weekend? I thought maybe we could go fishing like we used to. There's a spot near Seattle I found. It's quiet, got a good view of the mountains." I paused, the memory of our fishing trips flashing through my mind, early mornings at the lake near Eugene, the two of us with cheap rods and a bucket of worms, Caleb laughing every time he caught a fish, even if it was too small to keep. "Yeah," I said finally, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I'd like that." That Saturday, I drove up to Seattle, the highway winding through forests and past small towns, the air growing cooler as I neared the city. Caleb met me at a diner just off the interstate, a place with neon signs and a waitress who called us Han as she poured our coffee. He looked better, still tired, but lighter somehow, like some of the weight had lifted. We drove to the fishing spot, a quiet lake surrounded by pines, the water glassy under the morning sun, the Olympic mountains rising in the distance like a painting. We didn't talk much at first, just set up our rods and cast our lines, the plop of the lures breaking the silence. But as the hours passed, the words came easier. Small things at first, like the best bait for trout, the way the light hit the water just right at dawn. Then deeper things, memories of Dad teaching us to fish, the way Mom would pack us sandwiches for those trips, the time Caleb had fallen in the lake and I'd had to fish him out, both of us laughing until we couldn't breathe. "I've been thinking a lot," Caleb said after a while, his line still in the water, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "About what you said at the diner, about how I erased you. I didn't realize. I didn't see how much I'd hurt you until I saw your face that night at the gala. And after, when I thought about it, really thought about it, I couldn't stop seeing all the things you did for me. The late nights, the way you always showed up, even when I didn't. I took it for granted, Ethan. I took you for granted. I kept my eyes on the water, my throat tight. The words I wanted to say stuck behind a wall I wasn't ready to break. I just wanted you to have everything, I said finally, my voice low. I didn't care what it cost me, as long as you got there. I know, he said, his voice cracking. And I did get there, because of you. But I forgot what it cost you. I forgot what it meant to be your brother. I want to fix that, Ethan. I want to be here. Really be here. Not just when things fall apart. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and we sat there in silence for a while, the fish ignoring our bait, the sun climbing higher in the sky. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, not the kind you see in movies, but it was real. A step forward, a promise to try, to rebuild what we'd lost. One fishing trip, one pizza night, one conversation at a time. Over the next few months, Caleb kept showing up, not always in person, but in ways that mattered. He'd call to check in, not just when he needed something, but to ask about my day, to hear about the carburetor I'd rebuilt, or the old radio I'd fixed. He sent me a package for my birthday in July 2024, a new set of tools, the kind I'd always wanted, but could never justify buying, with a note that said, "For the best brother I don't deserve." He invited me to Seattle for Thanksgiving, a small gathering at his apartment, just the two of us and a couple of his friends from work. The table piled with turkey and mashed potatoes, the air filled with laughter and the clink of glasses. I saw a side of Caleb I hadn't seen in years. Unguarded, genuine, the kid I'd raised peeking through the polished exterior he'd built. We played cards after dinner, the same deck we'd used that night in my apartment. And when I beat him at our old game, he laughed. A real laugh, the kind that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, the kind I'd missed more than I could say. In August 2024, I finally told him about the land. We were sitting on my fire escape, the Deschutes River glittering below us, the stars sharp against the night sky. I'd been nervous to bring it up, worried he'd dismiss it again, but I wanted him to know, wanted to share this piece of me I'd kept hidden. "I bought it a few years back," I said, my voice steady as I handed him the deed, the paper creased from being carried in my pocket. "The lot where the house was. I don't know what to do with it yet, but..." I couldn't let it go. Caleb took the deed, his fingers tracing the words, his eyes soft with something I couldn't name. "You bought this?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "After everything, you bought it back?" "Yeah," I said, looking out at the river, the water catching the starlight. "It's where we started. I wanted to hold on to that, even if it's just a patch of dirt now." He was quiet for a long time, the deed still in his hands, his thumb brushing over the faded ink. "I remember that house," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "The way the porch creaked when we'd run across it. The way Mom would sing in the kitchen, even when she was just making toast. I didn't realize how much it meant to you." "It means something to me because it was ours," I said, my voice soft but firm. "And I wanted to keep that, even if you didn't." He looked at me then, his eyes wet, a small smile breaking through. "I'm glad you did," he said. Maybe we can do something with it. Together." I didn't say anything, just nodded, the possibility hanging between us like a fragile thread, one we could weave into something stronger if we tried. We sat there for a while, the night wrapping around us, the river's quiet song a backdrop to our shared silence, a silence that felt like understanding, like home. A few weeks later, in September 2024, Maria called me at the shop, her voice bright with excitement. "Ethan, you gotta see this," she said, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "Your brother's in the paper. His company's back on track. New investor, smaller deal, but solid. And listen, he mentioned you. Said he wouldn't be anywhere without his brother who held him up." I smiled, the kind that starts small and spreads, warmth blooming in my chest. "Thanks, Maria," I said, my voice steady. But inside I felt something shift, something settle, like a piece of me that had been broken was starting to mend. Good to know. That night, I drove out to the lot, the deed tucked in my jacket, a flashlight in my hand to light the way. The stars were sharp over the empty field, the air cool and still, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood where our porch used to be, imagining the creak of the old swing, Mom's voice calling us for dinner, the way Dad would whistle as he worked in the yard. I thought about Caleb, about the gala, the diner, the fishing trip, the pizza night, the years we'd lost and the ones we were starting to find. I thought about Dad's promise and how maybe I'd kept it, not by giving Caleb everything, but by giving him a way back, a chance to be my brother again. I still fix things, pipes, cars, lives, one bolt at a time. My apartment's the same, my hand's still rough, but I'm not waiting anymore. Not for Caleb, not for anyone. I'm living for me, for the guy who kept going, who kept loving, who found peace in the quiet spaces. And Caleb? He's part of that now. Not the center, but a piece, a brother who's learning to show up, to be here, to remember where we came from. And to you, watching this, I want to ask, what would you do if someone you loved looked you in the eye and said you weren't theirs? Would you fight for them or let them go? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. If this story touched you, hit that like button, just to let me know you're out there. And subscribe, because there's more to share. Stories of hurt and hope, of breaking and building, the kind that remind us we're all carrying something, and we're all finding our way. Thanks for staying with me. I'll see you in the next one.